Now we're ready to implement the category picker item component. Let's start with the props. What props do we need here? Well, let's go to our app picker component. This is where we're going to use our picker item component. So this component should have two props, label and onPress. So let's add them over here, label and onPress. So both this component and the original picker item component, they have the same API. They have the same interface. Both these components support these two props, okay? Now, here I'm going to start with a view. This acts as a container. So let's import the style sheet module right away and create our styles. Next, we set the style to styles.container. Now, inside this container, we need an icon and a label. So let's use our icon component. This gives us an icon with a background color. So let's set background color and the name of the icon. Now, where do we get these values from? There are two solutions here. We can add them as props here, but the problem with this approach is that we have to go back to our app picker and specify the background color and the name of the icon name. Now, why is this bad? Well, these props only make sense in our category picker item component. As I told you before, both this component and the original picker item component, they should have the same interface, so we can reuse them the same way. So back to our app picker component, I'm going to delete these two props. Instead, I'm going to give this a new prop that is general and reusable, that is item, and we set it to the item that we're going to render. So it makes perfect sense that whenever we want to render a picker item component, we should know what item we want to render. Now, this item is an object. It can have a bunch of properties. It can have background color. It can have an icon and so on. With this approach, here we are not adding props that only make sense in the context of a category picker item component. Okay? So save the changes. Back to our category picker item. Here we add a new prop item. For consistency, we can go to our picker item component and add that new prop here. With this change, we no longer need the label because we can get it from the item, right? So we're simplifying the interface of this component. So let's render item.label, okay? Now back to the category picker item component. Again, we don't need the label, so now we only have two props. Beautiful. So let's get the background color from the item and the name from the item as well. So we set this to item.icon, okay? Save. So here's our icon. Let's also set the size to 80. Now, after the icon, we need a label. So I'm going to use our app text component. And here we render item.label. Pretty straightforward. Let's test our implementation up to this point. So save the changes. Back in our app, tab. We get these black circles because we haven't specified the background color and icon for each item. So we go to our listing edit screen. This is where we're defining our categories. Let's give each category a background color. Let's say red and an icon. For now, I'm just going to use random background colors and icons. Later, I'm going to replace this with actual colors and icons. So let's set the background color to green and the icon to email. And one more time. Here, I'm going to use the lock icon. Save the changes. Take a look. We're getting there. Now for our category screen, we don't want to lay these out vertically. We want to have multiple columns. We want to have a grid of categories. How do we do that? Well, we go to our app picker component. This flat list has a prop we haven't talked about. It's called num columns. Let's set it to 3 and see what happens. So now we have 3 columns. But we don't want to hard code 3 here because this only makes sense for our category screen. Somewhere else in our app, we just want to show a flat list of items. So we should set this dynamically where we're using our app picker component. So I'm going to set this to a new prop, number of columns. Now, let's add this prop. So we added over here, number of columns. That also means we should go to our app form picker and include that new prop here, number of columns. Yeah, here we simply pass this prop to our app picker. So number of columns equals number of columns. Now it's good to give this a default value. So back to our app picker, I'm going to set this to 1. So by default, we're going to have a single column. But in our listing edit screen, we're going to have 3 columns. So let's see where we are using our picker. Here it is. Here we're going to set number of columns to 3. Save the changes. Now everything works perfectly. So let's improve the styling of this component. I'm going to apply some padding here. So we go to our category picker item. In this container, let's set a padding horizontal of 30 pixels and a padding vertical of 15 pixels and see what happens. That looks better. Now look at the alignment of labels. They're not centered. So in this container, we should set align items to center. The reason I use this property here is that by default, flex direction of this container is set to the vertical axis. And here we want to align this component along the horizontal axis. So that is the secondary axis, which means we should use the align items property. Okay. Now this label is so close to the icon. So let's give it a style. I'm going to set margin top to 5 pixels. And then we apply the style over here. Let's take a look. Here's the final result. That looks pretty good to me. So now I'm going to pause the recording and replace these icons and their background color. Here's what we get. It's a lot better. Now there's a tiny problem in the last row. Because we have a long label, this view, this container has grown larger than the others. So these 2 containers are pushed to the right. Fixing this problem is very easy. Here are the styles for our container. So we set the width to 33%. Take a look. The problem's gone. Now look at the label. Currently it's left aligned. I would like to make it center aligned. So here we apply text align to center. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now one last thing before we finish this lesson. Let's go back to our listing edit screen. Let's see what happens if we don't specify this custom picker item component. I'm also going to set the number of columns to the default, which is 1. We get this error because we cannot change the number of columns dynamically. So we have to manually reload the app. Now, if we don't supply our custom picker item component, this is what we get.